Hey everyone, and welcome back to Mriyaslava. In today's episode, I'm going to be tackling European-style city blocks. This is something that I've been talking about for a really long time, and if you've been watching my past videos, you've heard me sort of complain about the grid-style zoning system that City Skylines has and the limitations of that. Namely, when it comes to European cities, which iconically have buildings which fill unique and irregularly shaped city blocks. So not necessarily a perfect grid, but actually, like some polygonal blocks or slightly not perpendicular. So this is something I've been wanting to do for a long time, and now with mods finally out, like Move It especially, we're finally able to do that, and we can clip buildings together to form those blocks. And so obviously by now, Mriyaslava has grown to be a pretty big city, so I would have to go back and redo all the blocks, and that's exactly what I did. I went and I changed all the existing city blocks to be these European style blocks with all the buildings clipping into each other and making this one homogeneous structure essentially. And you can see the before and after here, the difference that it made to the character of the city. It's extremely significant, and it's obviously it's quite time consuming, which is why this video took so long, but I'm really glad that I went through with this. And I'm also hoping that this video will sort of act as a bit of a tutorial to those that also want to do this. I'll have some words of advice and some feedback based off of my experience doing this, and sort of what I've learned is the best way to go about it. So without further ado, let's get started. So in the last video, we built out the university area and the campus that surrounds it a little bit. But I was really unhappy with how it turned out, ultimately. It felt very disjointed. I mean, not the university itself, but the residential buildings they had around it. It didn't feel European, and more than that, it felt very random. I zoned all the grids that were next to the roads, and the buildings randomly spawned in, and I really didn't like that. So to try out this European city block style, I decided I'd start with the campus area first, because I knew I was unhappy with it, so I was more than glad to tear it all down and start from scratch. So that's exactly what I did. You can see I deleted a bunch of buildings from that block there, and I'm starting here with a couple of low rent buildings. So I have those low rent towers next to the train tracks, and then here in this block right in front of them, I'm going to try filling them out with some actual mixed use residential buildings. Now there's two reasons why I'm using mixed use. Number one is I'm pretty sure it's the only zoning type that has buildings designed to go wall to wall, which is perfect for what we're doing here, because that's exactly what we want. We're trying to clip them together wall to wall. And number two is because if you've been to a European city before, or if you are European, then you know how many mixed-use buildings you have with the shops on the bottom floor and then apartments on top. And even if that's not everywhere, at least in my experience, it's just so convenient that I really wanted that to be the prevailing zone type here in Mriyaslava. Now keep in mind, we're learning together here. This campus area is the first area of the city that I'm really trying out this technique in. So I put down a couple of buildings there, and now I'm putting down some paths and a little park because I realized how few of them we have in the city. And then I'm going to be basically putting the buildings around this path. Now that's not exactly what I ended up doing downtown, but here where I was still learning, I tried this out, and I think it did turn out pretty well in the end. I think planning it around the paths is really good in some areas. Here especially, in this campus area, I wanted there to be, lots of paths and for it to be extremely walkable. So that's what we're doing here. Now putting down the buildings themselves isn't, that complicated. It was a little tedious at the beginning, so you can see here with the Find It mod or whatever it's called. I don't remember if it's also called Find It in City Skylines too, but it's the equivalent. You know what I'm talking about. I was using this before the thumbnails mod came out, so all the buildings had the same thumbnail, and so I was always just searching and finding buildings based on their size and level. So that was a little bit tedious, and it definitely got way easier once the thumbnails were introduced. But you can see here after I've clipped them all together with Move It, you know, the difference it made compared to what it looked like before with just those random buildings next to each other. Now I gave that treatment to basically the rest of the campus area, and you'll see that in a cinematic shot in just a second. But the next thing I wanted to do before I finished off with this and I went downtown was put down this geological research center. It's just a really nice looking building. It really fills out the space I had here, and then I'm just tying it into the rest of the city with these pedestrian paths. You'll see me doing this in a lot of this video, but as the saying goes, if you build it, they will come. So I've been putting down a lot of these pedestrian paths, and the citizens love them. They get a ton of usage, and we get a walkable city in the end. So it's a win-win for everyone. You can really see the difference that this rebuild did to the campus area, and it's still not perfect. I think I'd still like to come back to it at some point to do some additional detailing with maybe some custom assets once those are out. But for the moment, you know, this is, I think, a big upgrade. So with my first attempt on the campus area now done, I wanted to move on and actually take on the city itself, so the downtown. So you can see here I cleared out a bunch of city blocks, and now we're going to be putting down the buildings in here. Now right here in the downtown core, I chose to go with the highest level buildings that I can because they're the tallest and the highest lot size that would fit in here, which is these 6x6 buildings, since they would give us the best population density. The reason why I'm even concerned about population density in the first place is because if you look at European cities, they don't have skyscrapers to the same level that North American cities do. So I did want to keep skyscrapers to a minimum. We will still end up with a bunch of skyscrapers because things like residential high and office high, they all use skyscrapers for those zone types. So it's kind of unavoidable, but I did still want to try to avoid it wherever I could. And so here I'm doing that by having these higher density mixed zoned units. So I was still figuring stuff out with this city block because remember, I'm going to have dozens of other blocks to do as well. So I really wanted to make sure that I got my process down. And so here what I did is I put down the corner pieces first, and then I filled in the gaps with the straight pieces. But I think what I found later on is that doing it the other way around and actually putting down the straight pieces and then just filling in the corners tends to be a lot easier. So I don't know, maybe something to take away from this if you try to do that. Although I guess it really does depend on the city block. If it's a non-rectangular block like the ones are here, and in that case I think like what I just said makes more sense. You put down the straight pieces and then the corners. But if it's rectangular, if it's a perfect grid, I guess it doesn't really matter because you can find stuff to fit every part of that very easily. But either way, going back to this block that I'm working on now, you can see how it sort of looked like at the end, and you could see me here putting down the straight pieces. I think I was a little overzealous with this one. I wanted there to be sort of like a gap in the middle where people can walk through because it was a pretty big one. But what I ended up doing later on is just basically making every block like full, so I don't have any gaps between buildings. I did in some cases, in some places it's not that big of a deal and it still sort of works as like a entrance into the inside of that block. But it was kind of unnecessary in many places, and it was just easier to have them border the entire inside of that block. And here again, you can see me working on those paths. This is a method that I sort of adopted in pretty much all the blocks that I did in this build, which is just to sort of border the inside of those buildings with a path. And it gave it a nice outline. It sort of brought everything together because every one of those buildings has like a backyard that sticks out, and they don't always, connect together really nicely, especially when you're clipping stuff together like this. So bordering it and then just having some paths go across as like interconnections works really well. And it also hides the zoning grid, which is kind of annoying when you're looking at it in the zone view that you can't toggle off the zoning grid, so it clears that up a little bit. I had this sort of empty lot here in between some of the buildings, so I didn't want to waste it, and I put down this little fountain and some paths around it and made it into a little park. What I'd really like to do at some point, and I don't know if they'll ever add this to City Skylines too, but is sort of define custom park areas. So in Park Life in City Skylines 1, you could draw out basically like a district for where a park was. And I think something like that would be really cool for CS2 as well, because I found that I made a lot of little areas like this, and I think defining them as parks, as places that people actually want to visit would be really nice to have. Now, after you've placed down all your buildings and your paths, you still have a lot of empty space in the middle, and it's pretty obvious when you look from above. So to fill it out, a key part of detailing for me was just putting down a ton of foliage. And you can see here earlier on where I'm still figuring stuff out, I put a lot of time into this, and I'm putting down like different clusters of bushes. But later on, I was just like putting down a bunch of oak trees and just spamming some birch trees and calling it a day, because when you look from above, it doesn't really matter. You can see the trees there and the space is filled in, and it gives you that extra little bit of detail. So you can really see now that things are shaping up. Slowly but steadily, those blocks are making a real difference to how the city looks. So in this next segment, you can continue to see my method evolve, and I wanted to explain a little bit of that methodology because right here, we are next to the river that goes through Mriyaslava. So this river is a key part of the city. We have the pedestrian streets that go around it and all the bridges across it. So I really wanted to tie it into this build somehow. And so what I'm doing is I'm going to try to establish a height gradient. So basically you have shorter buildings on the bank, and then the further away you get from it, into the core of the city, the higher the buildings get. This is a pretty natural thing that we see in real cities all the time, but the way I'm replicating it here is just by choosing buildings that have a slightly smaller lot size. So I think these are 2 by something, which just tend to be smaller in general, because it would be weird to have a really skinny building that's insanely tall. Or by choosing buildings that have a lower level. So if you go down to like level 3, level 1, you can really get smaller buildings to go here. But I think these are still level 5, just smaller lot sizes. I actually really like the buildings that I used here. They're probably my favorite out of all the mixed zone buildings. I don't know why, they're really simple and nice. They're kind of modular, So I ended up using them a ton throughout the city. The only thing is I'd really like to be able to recolor them to, look consistent. And as a matter of fact, I just found out that there's actually a recolor mod. So that'll be maybe something to use between now and next episode, and give the city a little bit of that consistency. And so you can see me here putting down some foliage again. I think that Tampere, which is the map that I'm building Mriyaslava on, by default has pine and birch trees everywhere, or maybe it's pine and alder. But either way, I try to, stick with that just so it feels natural and it fits the map, obviously. I tend to use a lot more birch than pine, just because I personally like birch trees more. But that's sort of the palette that I tend to stick to, as well as all these green bushes that I'm putting down everywhere. Now we're going to take a brief break from the city blocks for a second, because I realized while I was doing them that our fire rating in the city is actually pretty bad. So you can see here I'm clearing out some space and unzoning all of that, because we're going to be using these city blocks to put down a new fire station. So you can see the fire hazard there is in the red, so that's not a good thing. So basically I just unlocked this fire station and then looked for a space for it. These city blocks that I deleted ended up not fitting it, so I'm just going to put it in this pair of blocks right there, but it doesn't matter because we were still going to have to delete those blocks and rebuild them manually anyways. Now I don't know how fitting this fire station is in terms of integrating into an urban environment, but I did my best, and you'll see that in the cinematic clip in just a second. But just as with every service building in this game, I put down the main building and then I found what sub-buildings it has, and if I needed to, I put that one down just to sort of occupy the space. And so in this case, I did put down I think it's the Disaster Response Edition. It's this big sort of triangular wedge-shaped building, and I just put it behind there because it fit into the lot. This is one of those areas that I would like to maybe come back to in the future and maybe change the layout up a little bit or just detail it a little better. But for now, I basically just filled in all the space next to it with a bunch of buildings, and I think it turned out pretty okay. So I've talked about detailing a lot, and that's the next thing we're going to cover here. So after you've clipped together all the buildings, you still end up with these gaps everywhere, whether they're a little bit further back from the road than they're supposed to be, or just the front yard is not perfectly aligned to the one next to it because they're at an angle. And that's where the surface tool comes in. So the surface tool, area tool, whatever you want to call it, with extra detailing tools, we finally got access to all these surfaces that we see around the game. And they work just like the district tool or like the landfill, where you can define a specific area just by drawing out the shape, and then it will fill in that area. And man, this is such a useful tool. I wish we had something like this in City Skylines 1, because it's like Surface Painter, but 300 times better. It's so flexible, you can draw out any shape, you have so many surfaces to choose from, and there's people adding more on the workshop already all the time. Surfaces are definitely the main way I've been detailing so far. You can see here I filled in those gaps with the concrete tiles earlier, and then here I'm just putting down some grass in between shops while still leaving access there to the doors. So that way you have your sidewalk right next to the road, and then you also have a separated sidewalk next to the shops, and they're kind of segregated in that way. Now you'll see me do this in just a second, but then I put fences around the grass areas, and then some trees to provide some shade, and then benches and trash cans and stuff like that. Now you'll see me do this in just a second, but after I finish with the surfaces, I then go in with net lanes and I put down some fences around these grass areas. It's a nice little ornamental touch, and I think it makes them look a little bit more intentional. And then after I finish with the fences, I then put down some street trees for a little bit of shade, and again it fills up the area as well a little bit. And then after that I also have some benches and trash cans and lights and that sort of thing. Now, I love to give every city block this treatment, but I found that it was just way too time consuming with the amount of blocks I had and how large they tend to be. Some of this detailing ends up taking like half an hour per block. This one wasn't too bad because the buildings were pretty nicely arranged and I just had a couple areas to fill in. But there are others where it's, all the way around, and that takes, up to 45 minutes sometimes. I ended up only doing this in key areas of the city, so near a signature building or a monument or even a station somewhere. Areas that you expect you're gonna screenshot. Otherwise, I didn't have the time to do this everywhere, and that would be my advice to you as well. It is a very time-consuming process, and if you have the time, by all means, but I would definitely just suggest doing it in the areas that are most important to you. Now, what you've seen in this video so far, I essentially took this process and I applied it all over the city to all the remaining city blocks. And in the end, this is what we've ended up with. This is what Mriyaslava looks like now. Now, obviously, even at its current size, it's a pretty big city, and I couldn't show everything in the video. So I thought maybe we'd just go on a quick tour and I'd show you guys around the place. Now, we started this video off with the campus area, so maybe let's start there. You can see what all those city blocks look like now. Much more dense, much more organized. And then you can also see that I included some low-rent housing over here to the left, as well as over here by the river, some waterfront properties. And then if we continue past the river, we can get into the city proper, and you can see just how much more dense it is compared to what it was before. Now, when I say I redid all the city blocks, I really do mean it. I basically rebuilt the entire city, but every time I look at it, I just can't help but think how worth it was, because it just looks so much better. And you can really see here that height gradient I was talking about, getting lower towards the waterfront. And actually, this little block of buildings right here is one of the few purely commercial areas that I built. I didn't end up building too many of these. Most of it was mixed zoning, but I did want to experiment a little and try with a few little dedicated shopping areas like this. And I also have this block over here that I did, which is nice and close to the university, so students can come and shop or eat if they want to between classes or something. Now, out of everything I did in this episode, I think my favorite has to be all the little park areas that I built, here and there around the city. Now, I didn't put them everywhere, just occasionally, like this fountain that you saw me build earlier. But it really is just fun building those spaces. I did another little hidden fountain park in this block of buildings on the campus. And I think the reason it's so fun is because, as you're building, you're thinking, well, is this an area that I'd like to spend time in? And so I did a number of other little parks like that, like this one by the train station next to Notre Dame. Might have to clear a few of those trees to get a better sight line, but has those nice curvy paths. All those new parks that were added in that last big update are really great to use. Just like this ring park here, which I put right by the river. It's a great little spot to hang out by the waterfront. Another area that's less of a park and more of just like a public space is this little strip of kiosks that I added here in the city core. There's a bunch of chairs and tables there where you can just sit down and eat, and I thought that was a fun little unique build. Now, something else I did that might actually come as a bit of a shock to some viewers is I added some parking to the city. I know it's sacrilege, but we were getting to a point where I thought we could do it. We have a population of 75,000 people, and over half, 44,000, use just trains alone. So we get huge public transit usage, and I thought, well, maybe I can ease up on this a little and actually add some parking. I do wish the underground parking entrance was a little bit smaller. The whole idea with underground parking is that you can hide it all underground so that the land above is free to use, but it is a little bit bigger than I'd like. It takes up a good amount of space. Now, don't worry, I didn't go too overboard with parking. I did add a couple of more of these covered parking areas next to the buildings behind the train tracks here, but that's about it in terms of parking. Now again, like I said, I did redo every city block, and that included all of the offices we had zoned earlier, so I removed all the low-density offices, which really didn't fit with the style, and replaced them all with a couple skyscrapers. And then because you can't really build them wall-to-wall, so I just filled the space in between them with a bunch of paths, and like here, for example, you can see I have hedges lining the paths and trees inside, so I just tried to make them enjoyable and make use of that space as best as I could. There is still a lot of work to be done. For example, in this area over here, our citizens are complaining about noise a lot. That's probably because of the taxi and bus depot we have over here. So in the next episode, I think we might move those over here, since we've kind of already established this as a transit area. We have our metro depot and our rail yard here already. So there is space for it, and it would also make sense there. We do have an apparent lack of trams as well, so I did earmark this land over here as some potential room for another tram depot. We also do want to keep expanding, and I'm thinking that this land over here by the main plaza is looking pretty ripe. There's actually a ship path not too far, so I think that might make for some interesting developments. But that'll have to be for the next episode. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.